Welcome to episode 170 of Silver Lining for Learning. It's been a while since we had a host reflect conversation, and there are many things that we can reflect on. Recent shows, future shows, things happening in the world today, and so on. And I'm curious as to what my co-hosts are going to select as what they want to discuss. So since I'm moderating, I get to call on who goes first. Any volunteers?
I'll be
happy to go. Go ahead.
All right, go ahead.
Oh, you go.
No, go ahead. Okay. So, yeah, it has been a while since we had a host reflect, and I really haven't had a chance to go back and look at the past episodes to sort of refresh my mind because so much is going on. But I do think, this show started in some ways under the shadow of COVID, at a point when things looked pretty bleak and dark. And then, of course, Zhao came up with this idea that what if schools were closed for a year? And which, of course, I scoffed at that time. I remember thinking like, this is going to last for 6 weeks. And so I sort of blame him for all of that going on and on. And again, I think we are again at this point in time, just as a planet, as a species, facing some really dark moments. We had the people from Monash who talked about the work that they've been doing with refugees. We had the scholar from Ukraine. So it's not that we are not sensitive to these issues, but I think also for us, the way I see it is, we are a show about education. We are a show about learning. We are a show about how there are better and newer possibilities. In no way does that not acknowledge the dark moments that we are at. And so I think we need to be respectful of that, but I would respectfully also submit to the four of us that we focus on what we can speak to, which is issues around teaching, education, learning, technology, the changing world, and things that way. So I don't know what other people think about that.
Well, I mean, one of the things we started when the COVID started, one of the problems I think we did not really anticipate was the human conflicts. We kind of thought about how COVID might change schools, but I don't think it has changed schools that much. However, COVID, I wouldn't blame necessarily as the only reason, but after COVID or during COVID, we're seeing the rise of human conflicts. And that is, I've been thinking quite a lot. Punya, I was doing a webinar with your colleague, Iveta, for AACTE on the webinar about using technology to promote a global competence.
I recommended your name for that, by the way.
What's that?
I was the one who recommended your name.
Oh my God! So that thank you. So I was recommended by you. That's good. But anyway, so the idea is that today we live in a very divided, fragmented, for whatever reason we're doing, and our schools seem to have been withdrawing from engaging with students in other places. So technically, to this technology, we should be more expansive. We can learn globally. We can learn with anyone globally. We can learn for other people globally. But our schools, our students have become increasingly isolated. For example, we used to have teacher education programs, interactions with Russia, China. I don't know how many exist, anymore. We used to have teachers connecting students globally. I don't know how many more exist. So to me, I think this kind of reflection, it would help us to rethink about our children in 5, 10, 15, 20 years, probably will live in a re-globalized world where they need to connect with others. And so I think to this isolation does not help. And with artificial intelligence, with all this technology, politics can control them, but you won't be able to control forever. So that's my thinking right now.
So,
Curt, go ahead.
No, can I jump in quickly with a quick comment, Curt? Is that okay?
Yeah,
Thank
of course.
So one of the things I've been thinking about, and it's sort of related to this point, that I look back to like me in 2005, 2006, 7, 8, when social media was first starting, when we had the Arab Spring and all of that. And I felt this like, oh, wow, knowledge is now getting democratized, sharing of knowledge. There was this sort of, that this is sort of the second Gutenberg revolution. I had a very positive sort of sense about that. And in hindsight, to see how these social media have been used to polarize, have been used to spread misinformation, the sort of psychosocial impact of these technologies on teenagers, particularly girls, we are seeing these implications of that. And so now when I think about, look back on myself and I say like how naive I was about that, right? And so one thing that I've decided that I'm not going to be naive anymore. So as I'm thinking about AI in particular, because I've been thinking a lot about that. So there's a part of my brain which is like, okay, there are possibilities here for education and for learning, and those are great. But what are the sort of broader social impacts of these technologies and political, geopolitical impact of these technologies going forward is something that I want to keep thinking about, because I think the shape that this technology will take will be determined by a lot by sort of the broader economics of this technology. Because social media, if it hadn't gone the advertising and engagement and eyeball route, could have had a very different effect. But by emphasizing the amount of time that you spend, it automatically pushes you towards more radical perspectives. Like that's what YouTube's algorithm started doing. Now they have sort of pulled it back, but at one point that was what it was doing, right? And so I've started thinking a lot more about that we have to, as educators, and particularly those who are in the field, that we can't be just thinking of the here now. We need to be thinking about sort of the broader social and political implications of these technologies, right? So anyway, that was just a quick thought on that.
You're muted, Curt.
Curt, your voice isn't coming through. Nope.
Still don't hear me.
Yep, now good.
Got me, okay. So I want to introduce the co-host of the show, Dede from Harvard, Punya Mishra from ASU, and Yong Zhao from University of Kansas and University of Melbourne. I am Curt Bonk, the fourth co-host of this show today, and I would like to add to what's been said, but it's going to be in a roundabout way. During the past week, everyone, a high five. Actually, just yesterday, I sent calendar 2 to the printer. I'm working on a calendar on leadership, learning, and life, year 2, 2024. It's on IU in Bloomington, all new quotes. So I'll be printing them and sending you guys a copy. But the other thing I'm working on relates to what the discussion is in a roundabout way. I want to ask all three of you, have you ever been asked to write a foreword to a book and didn't write it until the last minute and really didn't know what you were going to say because you didn't get the entire book sent to you? In fact, you didn't get the introduction sent to you until the last minute. And so that's how, I've been wrestling with this writing a foreword, and I've got ACT conference next week and the Online Learning Consortium Accelerate the week after. So I'm, life is up. And so yesterday, or the day before yesterday, I took a look at some old notes I made, and actually I started working on a book a few summers ago, and I never finished it. And I pulled out one of the chapters of the book, and it recounts a story of Thailand. And in that book, I talk about being invited to Thailand in 2006. And Thailand at the time was under a military coup. And David Jonathan was supposed to be the keynote for the conference, and he decided it wasn't safe enough for him to go. And so he recommended me. Thank you, David. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I was in Egypt, which also had a military coup a few years ago, as you all know. And I've been in the UAE and Saudi Arabia under trying times, real difficult times. And so, I thought about it a while. And I said, sure, I'll go, and the person that is being organized by the University of Missouri, a guy named Ta Boonsong was organizing, and he really did a wonderful job. And I celebrated my birthday there twice, once the night before, once the day of. It was a fantastic time to be in Thailand. But I was invited again in 2014 by the same guy. And he said, would you like to come? And I said, well, you have another military coup and another protest going on. People have been shot and killed. And I don't know. And I was assigned one hotel, and apparently someone was killed outside that hotel, and they switched my hotel. I just said, yes, I'll go. I had 12 previous trips in a row where ice was in the engines, pilots couldn't land the plane, flat tires on the runway. I said, you know, how stressful could this be, you know? But what became stressful was before I left for Thailand in 2014, I got an email from a former student saying, Curt, could you talk about Education 3.0? And I said, I don't know anything about Education 3.0. Do you know anything about Education 3.0? He said, no, we don't know anything, but the Thai government wants to be the leader in Education 3.0. And I said, well, I'll give it my best shot. And so I looked things up, and I did organize a discussion and presentation about Education 3.0. And I was invited 3 years later, and I got another email from folks, and they said, Curt, could you talk about Education 4.0? I said, do you know what Education 4.0 is? And they said, no, but I'm sure you could come up with something. But we have actually a really small white paper that's been written about the innovation age in Education 4.0. We'll send you that. And you can have that as a starter for your keynote presentation. Well, at the time, I was working on an idea I was calling Education 2020, 20 new roles of instructors and 20 principles of instruction. And so I could kind of reshape the talk into Education 4.0. And so I've taken all those notes and all my ideas and worked it into a book forward. But my point is that oftentimes, you know, we get in a moment where we are forced to struggle with issues and ideas and concepts, and new things spring to life, new models, new frameworks, and all that. And just like Silver Lining for Learning sprung out of a huge, you know, pandemic and dilemma for the entire world. And this happened to me in the last couple of days. I was, you know, took the previous notes about, you know, all the things I took notes on in 2006, 2014, 2017, in terms of the stress that was going on in Thailand, political, and yet couldn't wear certain color shirts, of course, when I arrived there because it represented different political factions within the country. But I went, and I think my thinking has evolved related to innovation in education, related to the 21st century teaching and learning principles and ideas, because I did agree to go, because I did meet new people and get their perspectives on things and incorporate them into my thinking. I think that's what education is about. And sometimes, you know, we're all struggle with these difficult times in front of us, but we also have to think about what can we do during this time that can help other people out, whether it's building a new framework or writing a new book or doing a book forward, whatever it is. So that's a long roundabout way of saying, you know, even despite the dilemmas, I think there's a lot of hope for us and for others to make a contribution to education.
So I want to cycle back to some of what we were talking about with education and say that there's a tacit set of beliefs and assumptions that industrial era education conveys, no matter what country it's in. One of them is that there's a right answer. No matter what the problem is, there's a right answer. And students don't really understand that the curriculum is made up of only problems with right answers, because that's how we can test people, as opposed to looking at the vast majority of real world problems, which do not have a single right answer. And so when people graduate from those systems all across the world as adults, if they don't realize what I've just said, they look at the world, they develop what they think is the right answer, and then everybody else is wrong, right? Because there is only one right answer. And it must be a fairly simple right answer, because that's what the curriculum is filled with, is pretty simple right answers. So that's, I think, a dynamic that underlies part of what we're seeing across the world, with people not adopting multiple perspectives, not seeing truth as complex and nuanced and maybe not even attainable in some situations, that there's this pervasive assumption that's been built into their education, and people who buy into it fully are rewarded by the testing system, about the world ultimately being a matter of you're finding the right answer and then making sure that everybody else gets it. There's also, of course, schools socialize. All across the world, schools socialize. Not a bad thing when everyone grows up in a region and a culture and, a country and so on. But socialization, again, is treated as a set of beliefs that are simply true, not as a set of beliefs that are part of a particular country or a particular culture or a particular point in history. They're just true. Nothing new about this. I grew up before the rest of you, but I would watch Superman on television, the Superman TV show, and Superman was about truth, justice, and the American way of life. And there was no subhead in there. The American way of life was right up there with truth and justice. In fact, it was truth and justice as far as Superman was concerned. And so it wasn't only in school, but it was in, the popular culture that these things happened. And again, we see kind of the consequences of that kind of education happening in the world now, where there is only one right set of beliefs, which varies from group to group and person to person. And if you don't hold those beliefs, then, and Punya, you talked about this, then you're not simply misguided. If you don't hold that set of beliefs, you're heretical, you're evil, etc. So, how do we rethink the curriculum? How do we rethink testing? How do we rethink education so that we don't graduate yet another generation with these kind of design flaws built in that lead to all these problems as adults? I'm asking that as a question that isn't rhetorical. I do not have an answer for that, but I think it's an interesting thing to think about.
So Chris, Punya and Curt, I want to announce to you right now, we are in a kind of full solar eclipse right now. So the outside is completely dark, it's annular, and just think about an eclipse. It doesn't happen very often. People get excited about it. And I was just thinking about when Chris was raising that question, if we heard about from Luba about a parent creating kind of a market micro academies for students who desire something different, for parents who want something different. We had the people working in the MENA, Mid East and North Africa region, talking about education over there, the different efforts. So I was just thinking about the innovations are there, but they are never spread. So I was just writing about this for our next episode. It's really about what I call the school within a school model. That is, I think in education, we have had a long time a bad habit of, if we do one thing, it has to be for all students, all teachers, the entire school, the entire system to change. When we design something, always apply, which is never in the business. Like, for example, when Netflix popped up, nobody said, well, Netflix is going to replace Blockbuster. But Netflix grows, right? Netflix in the middle, it grows. And there is a Vimeo, there's other possibilities grow. I think in education, we seldom allow innovations to grow as a tiny thing. You know, what if a school becomes many schools, that you allow students, teachers of different interests to pursue that? It's like, take advantage of the tiny eclipse, might be able to do something. So I've been thinking quite a lot about how we aim when people think they have the best idea in education. If they have the power, they won't apply to everyone. And when that application process, of course, meets with resistance, and so that imposition does not work. So I was looking at the all tiny innovations happening around the world, and we have captured many of them in our 170 episodes of our show. And how do we help them spread without imposing it on other people? Instead, it becomes an invitation.
So, just going back to something that Chris said, Zhao, I'll come to what you said in a second. So there's this great quote, and I'm not sure who it's from, and I'm going to mangle it anyway, but that for every complex human problem, there's a solution that is neat, simple, and wrong. And I think that one of the things, and this is part of sort of the technocentric culture that we live in, where it's not just in education that we see that, right? We see that in almost every aspect of human activity, where you think that, oh, we can have a quick technical fix to what are sort of underlying deeper issues. And so, the point that Zhao, you made at the beginning about like us starting during COVID, and that then are not recognizing that it can have these sort of geopolitical sort of shockwaves that spread, is partly that, right? So maybe we were naive in our thinking that just because we have this COVID, that is going to transform education per se, right? But so we were doing that, but we took a complex human problem and we came up with a solution that was neat, simple, but also wrong, And so now to connect back to what you were just talking about, why innovations don't spread, for me, actually, the solution is allowing for what I think you're suggesting as well, these micro innovations to survive and thrive, right? Because the expectation that we can take something that worked in one context and then indiscriminately expand it. I mean, I'm at ASU, so every time I hear one word that I hear all the time is, does it scale? Does it scale? And that, even though now I've been here for 7 years, that word just sort of makes me cringe, because it says that a solution that worked for one set of, in one context and one for an end of whatever can be, exponentially grown, and it would work across, right? I would much rather see things translate, because translation is an act of, it's a movement. Scalability, is like, it's like generalizability in quantitative methods, right? They say, is this generalizable? And guess what? Like, many of these things are not generalizable, but they are translatable. And so where I feel like what our show does is give examples or instances of where these innovations are happening, and then you can take it and translate it, move it, because that is the root of the word translate is of movement, right? I mean, in physics, translation is movement, literally. And I think thinking of it that way, to me, makes a lot more sense. Because otherwise we fall into that trap of like, oh, we have the solution and now we're going to apply it across the board. And guess what? It's going to be wrong. It's not going to work. Did I just kill the conversation?
Yeah.
No,
I'm done. This is it.
We're
done.
I like where you're going with it. And I think it does make sense to step back and talk about Silver Lining for Learning as a series and where we are in its history and how it relates to some of these larger themes. In some ways, I think of Silver Lining for Learning as like a botanic garden. And you have I've been in botanic gardens that had different regions. There was sort of the greenhouse, very humid tropical forest region, and there was the arid region, and there was the, sort of hot but wet region, and so on. You see my ignorance about microbiomes rapidly
You remember the domes on 27th Street, so
yeah
in Milwaukee.
And we kind of walk people through those different regions in the botanic educational ecosystem, and you see similar plants in terms of their function that look quite different in terms of their appearance, because they're doing the same thing, but they're doing the same thing under a different set of environmental constraints. And I think that's consistent. That idea of kind of evolution is consistent, Punya, with what you're saying, which is that you don't pick a plant that's working well in Iowa and put it up at the top of Canada and say, now grow. But you do think about, well, is there something up at the top of Canada that can fulfill the same purposes, maybe more like a loss or a lichen than a regular Iowa plant? And by finding those things and celebrating them, I think that we try to underscore the idea that design is intensely contextual. It's not just a little bit contextual, it's really intensely contextual.
Well, one thing that, Chris, what you're saying, I think I'll just go back to what Punya was talking about when you talk about contextual. It is not only in education, but it's in everything. It's like when people say this, Punya was talking about, we're always wrong. A lot of businesses have the same attempts and they fail. People like, once they have an idea, they want to dominate the world. I think what Silver Lining for Learning is doing, we're celebrating small innovations. We're not promoting them to take over the world. So Punya is talking about innovation to scale. I know, like ASU, I'm not criticizing, Arizona State University at all. You guys, over 100,000 students, you might reach like 5 million students in 3 years. I don't know where you are, but the idea of taking, we talk about in education, scalability of innovation in education. Policy researchers have done a lot of those things. If you look around over the past at least 50 years, we haven't seen any so-called systematic, system level innovations that have actually worked. We have done this very well. We spent so much time. So, to take innovation to scale, I think it's kind of quite dangerous, but that's what system leaders would like to do. So I just want to leave those few words for you to think about scale. Curt, I know you want to jump in.
I was just going to say that the word translate, I'm seeing increasingly in the literature and in job postings that my students are looking at. And so I appreciate Punya bringing up the word translate. And our show is really a bit about that process. We're translating what's happening out there in various countries of the world and trying to provide insights and questions about their findings or their projects, their initiatives. So I kind of wonder if we were to talk to the graduate students who might be listening to the show, who might want to help in terms of translation, what they could do. And, we all have edited books. That's one way to help translate what's happening in a specific area within the field, a niche area. Increasingly, I'm seeing people do systematic reviews of the research, not so much meta-analyses, but definitely systematic reviews, scoping reviews, and other kinds of things, as we get inundated with so much research out there that we have to find ways to make sense of it all. And one way that folks are translating work is doing these overviews of what the research is saying over a set period of time, whether it's 5 years or 10 years or the last couple of years, just COVID years or whatever. And my team has been doing that. We've done a series of systematic reviews of, the research on online learning during COVID, the research on self-directed learning within MOOCs. We've done several things. And this week coming at AECT, we're going to have a panel on online learning research systematic reviews that we had a special issue come out in March. And so one thing that people listening to this or watching the show might do, you can edit books, you can do a podcast show, you can write a blog, you can do systematic reviews, you can do scoping reviews, you can create your own YouTube channel. There are lots of ways to help other people and help yourselves understand what the literature says and where it's going and where the gaps are. And in part, Silver Lining's doing that. We're showcasing a bit about, oftentimes about things that are maybe not in mainstream journals, not in the books that you and I are typically reading, but they're important nonetheless. In fact, they're probably more important than most of the stuff we're reading about in our journals and in the books in the field or at the conferences that we have. I'd say that these 170 shows have had dozens and dozens and dozens of important and highly successful projects, initiatives that I'm really delighted that we had a chance to showcase and in turn help translate that work and make it available for others to think about and expand upon.
Sorry, Punya, you saw the eclipse. Can you tell us how it's going? You're on mute. You're muted.
Something really interesting. So one of the things that happens during an eclipse is that if you are near a tree, the gaps between the leaves of the tree act as a pinhole camera. And so if you go stand below a tree right now when there's an eclipse, you will have thousands of little eclipses around you. And so I can show that to you live right now. Do you see that on the shades?
Mm-hmm.
You are seeing little tiny little eclipses because there's a tree right outside the window and the sun is filtering through the trees. Otherwise you'd see little circles.
Oh,
Very cool.
So I was trying to, so I think it's
we
9:30.
can't say anything here. It's all cloudy. We just have
So 9:31 was peak for Phoenix. And so I had to leave and go and check it out. But even with my sunglasses, it was too bright, so I didn't stare at it. But I could get some pictures of my shades. And I have pictures of eclipses going back to when I was a grad student in Urbana-Champaign of exactly these little shadow eclipses. So anyway.
All right.
It's raining here in Indiana. We got no eclipses, nothing.
Well, I'm not sure that it was going over Indiana at all. I think, in fact, Smita and I talked about driving to New Mexico to see the full eclipse, and we had remodeling stuff at home, so that didn't happen. But that was part of I've always wanted to see a full eclipse. I've never seen a complete solar eclipse, so. Yeah, but anyway, exciting.
Okay, thank you. Back to the translation. So I was thinking about, we've been doing for 170 episodes. You know, from the beginning to today, we've covered so many countries, which reminds me of what we have really talked to. God, so many places. But at the same time, we kind of ignored the changes in society over the last more than 3 years. The society has truly changed. You know, I was in China. Chris, you wanted me to talk about China? I was in China twice. It is not the same as it was. It's definitely has changed. I am pretty sure, Punya, when you went back to India, you can feel the difference, so the word in German in the zeitgeist. I would just think about what's the spirit of the time? What's the spirit of the time? I would say 10 years ago, the collaboration, the sense of going up as a spirit is there. But now today, I think anxiety, chaos, depression is kind of common among many, many people. Another problem is we're seeing in education is the lack of teachers, lack of well-trained teachers. When we are talking about innovation, if you go around to different conferences, school leaders have changed. Many of them retired early or they left. We don't have enough school leaders. And if you look at teachers, it's very difficult to get well-trained teachers into our schools. If you look outside, schools are fighting over parents who wants to ban this book, ban that book, and then parents fighting back. Then we have the kind of DEI, diversity, equity, inclusivity in all kind of part of this whole thing. So the whole environment has changed. And I think, it would be meaningful for us to think about all these changes. What do they mean? Remember in the beginning, we had a lot of connections with China, Chinese educators, and gradually we lost that, And so I just feel a very strange time,
Yeah. So I want to pick up on one thing and connect it back to something I'd said before, which is I see this is where like part of my worry about is that with this combination of shortage of teachers, with the rise of AI technologies, we are going to come up with solutions which are simple and wrong. Right? So you're going to see, you're already seeing that with Khanmigo and so on, that, oh, we can have a tutor which can do this and which can do that. And it is going to be offered, it is going to become offered as a solution to the teacher shortage, which is that, oh, there is going to be a technical fix to it, and which is going to be some form of AI systems which is going to replace the educator and actually be better than the educator, because some initial studies will show that it is equivalent or whatever. And we will not think about the broader sort of social emotional consequences and the broader purpose of school, right? When COVID started, I wrote this one piece called The Value of School. And I gave a whole range of things that schools do, the last of which was disciplinary learning. That I was sort of being slightly tongue-in-cheek by putting that at the end. But schools do a lot in terms of being the centers of community, places where children learn to live and learn and play with each other, get the, what it means to be, a citizen in a democracy. I mean, there's a lot that schools do beyond the learning of science, math, humanities, whatever you may have, right? And I think that's part of it, what we are seeing this crisis, that we are going to see a lot of push for AI-based technologies to enter and replace teachers, which I think that worries me, in many, many different ways.
So going back to silver lining for learning and thinking about what we are creating on an ongoing basis, it isn't just that we have shows about a particular instance of educational innovation in a particular place, even though much of our episodes are about that. We also have episodes about cross-cutting things. And a good example is the experiential education episode that we had recently, since our last Host Reflect, which actually bears, I think, directly on some of what we were saying earlier. Because if you're raised within a particular setting with a particular set of beliefs that are inculcated into you, in part by education, that this is how things are, part of the power of experiential education is going somewhere else where that isn't how things are, and having to kind of confront that and gain a more nuanced perspective on what reality really is. And I think I don't want to sound too self-congratulatory, but given that we are designing this bottom up rather than top down, I think we have a nice balance between the kind of, here are instances and here are cross-cutting themes that can help people in a particular instance move beyond seeing that as a model that's going to generalize everywhere.
When we reflect back on this, what I've seen, especially in the episodes I was trying to organize, is the innovations outside schools, or schools that are trying to be different. When Punya was talking about schools serve many roles, I remember actually, I think David Berliner had a similar comment about when COVID just started happening, to say that schools do a lot more than teaching students, because our schools have in essence become the community center. Not, people, you go there for everything. Parents rely on schools for everything. It's become a much different place. But it just from a learning perspective, I think in many ways, our schools, the cornerstones of schools, have never really truly changed for the majority of schools, despite the fact that today you truly can learn, you truly can learn from other people. We've seen examples of that. So I was just wondering, from our examples, to think about what could happen in a global South, with human conflicts dividing people, what could happen in truly poor areas. My village in China is still very poor. Now they have food, but that's, food and clothing, that's probably what they have, the only thing. But in terms of education, it becomes actually more difficult because a lot of people are left, there are fewer children, the children have to go a long way to boarding, even younger kids, or they have to walk, an hour home, an hour back, there. So many countries are facing that. When industrialization comes, you still have tiny places. How do you serve those, small groups of children will be challenging. And I'm sure in those schools, they are not really using ChatGPT. Even the technology actually is there. When you have a smartphone, the phones actually can bring those technology there. I don't know why they're not using that. So that's the kind of, I think, complexity we will face in the future of our education. And I don't think there's one solution to any of those problems. But how do you inspire people? How do you get people to think they can do something? I saw this actually news yesterday, which kind of irrelevant, but kind of relevant. A 21-year-old, I don't know if you guys seen that, from Nebraska or University of Nebraska, was the first one to use AI to read the first word out of those papyrus buried and burned in the in the Pompeii, like the Vesuvius, the volcano eruption, I think 79 BC. That was, a student at a university can do this. It's kind of quite amazing, the power, but the person had an interest in doing that. How do we get our students to say, I'm interested in doing this and I can learn? So just a random thoughts about technology and remote areas, global South, and all the miserable places that we have on Earth. Well, I killed the conversation apparently, and so that is. I didn't mean to depress you. I was just thinking about how can we do better? It's that's just some way of thinking about this. Yeah.
Well, I'll go back to something Punya said earlier when talking about social media, which I think is a theme throughout educational technology and learning technologies. Technology can be used to homogenize, or technology can be used to allow diversity, empower diversity. And I see a lot of this happening now with generative AI, where, we're going to teach everybody to prompt engineer, and that way, whether you're a fifth grader in Africa or a fifth grader in Norway or a fifth grader in Colombia, you can get the same thing by typing in the perfect prompt into some kind of an omniscient AI system. Well, that's certainly the wrong way to think about things. But the tendency in looking at these technologies that have the power to diversify is to say, well, no, we don't want to do things bottom up. We don't want to do things that might be complex and nuanced. Let's just find a way to have the technology enforce something that's top down, uniform, and simple. And that's what education should be, after all, right?
So, Zhao, I have a slightly different take on, I think that's over ambitious to think that 4 of us sitting here on a Zoom call can change the conversation.
Really?
So,
You don't think we're changing the world? God,
no,
no. Okay, all right, go for it. Yeah, I
yeah,
always thought the four of us are the change in the kind of change
agents, yeah,
makers.
yeah.
Yeah, okay.
But that doesn't mean that what we do is not consequential, in the sense that some of the things we've already talked about in terms of examples and things that we are providing and promoting, these are some of these voices that we have managed to get because, like, the hard work really of the three of you, because I do much less of the getting the guests on the show. These are people who want to be on the show because they feel that they're doing something good, that they want that word to be spread, right? And so I think that is something that we do. And I think that I think we also raise important questions that at least, if nothing else, help me think. And that informs what I'm writing. It informs how I teach, and it informs how I interact with my colleagues, and so on. These are, I mean, crazy times that we live in. And I think what's been really sort of transformational for me in my thinking has been this sort of false narrative that I had built about progress and globalization and so on, that this is way more complicated than I thought it was, and that the local and the global are so weirdly interconnected. So at some level, Zhao, when you said that, we seem to be doing less and less of the globalization, at the same time, things that are happening in one part of the world are immediately transforming conversations and discussions and leading to tensions in another part of the world. So we cannot deny the globalization part, right? That's the world we do live in, and I think that's the tension that I'm still trying to figure out in my own head.
And I just want to remind us, in the recent MENA episode, that we had an interesting discussion about how people in that region want to modernize without westernizing, which is another spin on this issue of when people are marginalized and they want to better their lives, what options are they presented with?
I wonder if we might want to spend the last 10 minutes of the show talking about potentially ways to think about future guests, how we might recruit future guests, or what themes we might want to look towards, what issues we might want to include in the coming episodes, maybe in 2024, because we're almost filled up in 2023. Is there anything that we haven't had on the show previously that we might want to start thinking about including or highlighting? Or
so, if Curt, in response to this, so if you remember, this is a bunch of episodes ago, we had Dan Krutka and Marie Heath, who were talking about this thing called the civics of technology, where they're asking these sort of bigger questions about technology, its impact on society, and so on. I think that given sort of the threads that we should be trying to get some more guests of that nature. People who are in the Neil Postman mode of thinking about technology and society, the sort of the McLuhan mode, because those to me are more, they're all speculative for sure, but I think that they raise good and important questions that we need to be thinking about. That's one suggestion I have.
Well, I think there's another set of issues. But by the way, I would make a comment. We're all lazy, okay? Because we can't think beyond what we can think. That's the issue, right? We are limited by our own experiences, our expectations, and our efforts. So we don't know what other ideas might be. But there was one thing when Chris was mentioning about the MENA region, talk about modernization without westernization. I think that's, as we said in that episode, many countries are dealing with that. But there is one issue, like when we talk about learning, we seldom talk about the value of, value that infused with learning. When you are learning something, you learn value, you apply something to that. So if we could have some kind of discussion, some kind of debate about learning, learning, psychologically speaking, is just means a change of behavior. In the future, you've learned something, but value is very important. What do you learn? When we treat learning like as if education is just prepare people to learn, help people learn, but what is to learn? And that may have something to do with modernization and westernization. What are we learning? When we talk a paradigm shift in science and in education, we may have to deal with that as well. How powerful is teaching? How powerful is learning? And what are we learning? How that learning might hurt others, might help others. I think that might be interesting. I don't know who to invite, but this is one topic I'm thinking about is there pure learning, just pure, but I don't think so. I think there is, learning is always value laden, is driven by values.
So I just want to add that learning is not just changing behaviors. It is also, as Gabriel Solomon said long ago, some cognitive residue left at the end. If you're a cognitivist, not just a behavior. And hopefully we move beyond both cognitivism and behaviorism in our episodes and talk about, things of a greater community beyond the individual. And I think we are. I think many shows have emphasized or highlighted what's happening within a particular region of the world. And I think we should continue that. I think that's good. I was just raising the issue of, how can we, as a team, strategically attract people in our upcoming episodes in 2024? Who's someone that you would really love to have on one of our 2024 shows that we haven't had on yet?
Well, what comes to my mind is looking across the world of adults and saying, what didn't people learn in school that they really should have, that we need them to have learned in school? Conflict resolution, social perspective taking and empathy, ethical behavior. I mean, those are three big ones for me that, that one doesn't see in graduates from schools widespread across the world, and doesn't particularly see even in elite schools or schools that win a lot of awards for their excellence. So I'd love to find some folks who are doing interesting things with learning conflict resolution, ethics, and empathy in school settings, just to hear, how they're doing it and what challenges they're encountering and so on.
At my alma mater, there's someone doing forgiveness research who's been nominated for a Nobel Prize several times. I had classes with him. His name is Bob Enright. But I agree, social perspective taking might be a critical topic. Robert Selman is at your institution. We need to find the young people who are following in his footsteps, and or on other people's footsteps, creating their own footsteps and looking at social cognition, perspective taking. I agree, Chris, and ethics as well. So that's something I'll keep my eyes out for. Is there anything else that we would like to include in the future?
So there was a project within the Teachers College around this idea of principled innovation, which was sort of building out on the idea that just because we can do something, should we? And that work then expanded out and now is part of ASU's 9 design aspirations, that we look at the work that we do through that lens. It might be interesting to get somebody who is working in that space around either responsible innovation or principled innovation. I can think of a few people from ASU. Andrew Maynard, I don't know if you know him, he's a very interesting thinker. He thinks about sort of future of technology and technological transformation, but also from this perspective of responsible thinking. I can see he's a fun, he would be a great guest to have on the show.
Go for it.
So I can try and see and get him.
Well, I think it would be interesting in 2024 to get groups of students, high school students from different continents. It might be very interesting because we just want to hear from them. So I think let's try if we can get, if we just advertise that might be interesting from different continents, different countries, to say what are they thinking about, what are they going through? How's their life? How does AI or the change of economy or global conflicts affecting their lives? Are they worried? Are they anxious? Are they just thinking about going to school? It might be fun to do that. I think I can get some people from perhaps, China, Hong Kong, Australia, and some of them may be able to get them from Pune, like in India or Mid East. I think would be just students. I think it would be really interesting.
So people listening to the show or watching the show, send us an email if you got suggestions for students who might appear on the show. One of the most memorable shows that we had was the one that Young organized. We had a student from China and from Hawaii and from I think Australia, maybe it was, and that was just brilliant. And Young, if you could do another 2 or 3 shows like that, 2024 will be a stellar year. So,
let's plan to do 10 countries. It'll be fun. Actually, imagine 10 episodes with the students.
Yeah.
Just students.
Yeah.
I think it would be really fun. It would just be powerful. Okay,
Yeah,
I'll work on that. That'll be interesting.
Yeah.
That'd be fun. That'd be great.
Yeah, great.
Yeah. Okay.
Great.
Well, I'll start working. Okay.
If I can put just a little spin on that. It's notable that 2 of our 4 co-hosts basically began their life in marginalized countries and marginalized populations. And we're so fortunate that you're here and able to contribute. Arguably, coming out of Milwaukee, Curt and I fall sort of into that category, but not to the same extent.
No, I actually have to clarify this. I don't think I come from a marginalized population or in. I've been like being the caste that I am, the religion that I am, and my parents and my grandparents, incredibly privileged existence, right? So I do not. That's kind of interesting for me when this conversation happens, because I cannot, in any good faith, claim that at all. In fact, it is a misrepresentation of the privilege that I have, and I've had.
I stand corrected, but also it is true that, if you look at published scholarship in education, it's disproportionately weighted towards people who grew up in developed countries and had the right ethnicity and gender from their perspective. And, there's a lot of talent lost because of that. And so the students, there's another kind of theme that could be interwoven with asking the students. Well, anyway, I want to thank all of you.
Chris, what you said is so powerful. What is Punya, whether from a global perspective, I think you are still from the underprivileged group. In India, you might be, definitely you enjoy the privileges, but because one of the things, when I go out, people ask me to make a presentation. In some places, they still wouldn't believe a Chinese person can stand up in a place to speak to American audiences about education. So they only believe when I talk about China. And if I talk about education, there's people always come up to say, which country from? They don't care about what I say about education. So that is actually, out of this 30 some, God, how many years, 37, almost 40 years in the US, it is still the case. I don't know about Punya, but that experience is quite interesting. So thanks, Chris.
That may be, but I think that very often I get pulled into conversations of, people of color and things that way, where there are certain systemic disadvantages that people had, which I really did not have. I think, Zhao, your and my growing up were very, very different. I mean, I grew up in a world where my grandfather was a professor, had gotten a PhD from England. My mother almost got her PhD. My father had a master's degree. There were books all around me. Even within India, and I think even globally, I was in a pretty privileged place. And also due to my caste and things that way, there were certain doors that were always open to me. which were not necessarily. So I have to be very careful about that, because I get the point that you're saying. And Chris, I do appreciate that. I do think that I bring a different perspective to that space. I get that, right?
Yeah.
But there is another mantle that gets thrust on me sometimes that I have to be very careful to acknowledge that that's just not true in my case.
But you never had water buffaloes, so that's something you missed. But anyway, so Chris, go ahead.
I'm just going to say our hour is up. This has been fun. And Yong, you're going to introduce the next episode.
Thank you. So we've been talking about school reforms, school education transformation. What are the different approaches? So next week, we'll talk about building a new school within a traditional school. And I call this school within a school education transformation approach. And we'll be fortunate to have the head of the principal of All Saints College in Perth, Western Australia, and also the new school head, it's Esther Hill in this episode. And please remember next episode, because of the time differences, will be starting at 5 p.m. Pacific time, which is 8 p.m. Eastern time, which is happened to be 8 a.m. on the next day of Australia. Thank you very much. See you next week.